Hello again, this is Clark Harney, and we are continuing the series in the Saga of Humanity, the last part, and in the future we will discuss other things in the history of humanity. However, this section covers the Enlightenment realm. It is the post-Renaissance, post-Reformation period, before that of Romanticism and Industrialism. I hope that you enjoy this lecture. It will be very extensive and quite long, to say the least. So I hope that you can sit back, have a cup of coffee, or you prefer a drink or beverage of choice, and enjoy this lecture on the most important time in history of the world, the Enlightenment of the 18th century. A 16th century view of time and the enlightened realm of things. A description. Description and the descriptive method. Are we in another age of reason? To ask such a question implies that one know what reason is, given the complex notions of reason and rationality remain, historically speaking, in the hindsight of a 20th century, rather contested. Even philosophical and historical users of the definition of reason understand its etymology, but still disagree as to the nature of disagreement between the two ideas in time. When we do a word study of reason, expressed in language since the times of the ancient world of antiquity, we see that in the Greek language is pronounced vous. Firstly, the characteristics of vous, or reason, is that it is flexible, resisting fixed formulation. Other characteristics could be informed by experience, and it involves the living being. In Latin, intellectus. In German, Vernunft. In English, reason, allied to common sense, sensus communis, and in Vico's sense, not Kant's, it is logos, or dianoia, the characteristics are more rigidity and rarefied. Characteristics include mechanical and governed by explicit laws. In Latin, we have the word ratio, or ratio, and in German, Verstand. In English, it is also known as rationality. Understanding reason will be discussed more in depth. The Enlightenment, however, can be summed up in regard to its cognitive content through a relatively small number of beliefs, starting with what questions. In comparison, Romanticism, explored later on, and industrialism in the long 19th century, would not be summarized as this example simply because it is concerned with a whole disposition towards the world, which includes the holder of said disposition, and any possible beliefs that the holder of the disposition has in actual time and space that is necessarily distant insofar as perception and perspective is concerned. Now, according to Plato, vous, or reason, as opposed to rationality, is characterized by intuition, and according to Aristotle, it is vous that grasps first principles through induction. So the primacy of reason, right hemispheric, is due to the fact that rationality, left hemispheric, is founded on it. Immanuel Kant took these priorities and extended them in the 18th century. He did not necessarily reverse them. For Kant, Verstand, or rationality, has a constitutive role and is primary, while Vernunft, reason, has a regulatory role once Verstand, or rationality, has performed its task. In other words, reason is required to give intuitive, inductive foundation to rationality, but rationality ends up submitting its works to the judgment of reason. Rationality is regulatory. Important in history is to understand that reason depends on seeing things in context. So, in theory, any purely rational sequence can be abstracted from the context of any individual's mind and inserted into that of another, because it is rule-based and can, in a loose sense, be taught, whereas reason cannot be taught, but must come to extend and expand in its capacity for potential out of each individual's experience, and instantiated in that particular individual, including their feelings, beliefs, their values, and their judgments. The Enlightenment view of metaphor has a closely association with reason, namely that metaphor is either indirectly literal and reduced to literal language, or simply an ornament, irrelevant to meaning and rational thought. Metaphor is therefore just a linguistic device. It is a matter of words, but also a matter of thought. In order to understand Immanuel Kant, we must pay closer attention to the works of Descartes, the father of modern philosophy. We see here the method of Descartes. 1. Quote, "The first was never to accept anything as true that I did not know evidently to be so, that is, carefully to avoid precipitous judgment and prejudice, judging nothing more than I would have no occasion to doubt. 2. The second, to divide each of the difficulties or problems I was examining into as many parts as possible, and as it is required to solve them best. The third, to conduct thoughts orderly from simplest, or easy to know, objects to gradually rise, as by degree, to the knowledge of the most composite things, supposing an order amongst those things that precede not each other. And lastly, and fourthly, everywhere to compose enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I would be sure of having omitted nothing." There are problems with this method, but I won't go into that. An amazing claim for the method is that solving all questions or problems, theoretical or practical, by scientific reason. Quote, "These long chains of reasoning that geometricians commonly use to attain their most difficult demonstrations have given occasion for hoping that all things which fall into human knowledge follow in the same way, provided that one abstain from accepting anything true that is not true, 1, and that one always maintains the order to be followed in deducing one from the other. 3. There is nothing so far distant that one cannot finally reach, nor so hidden that one cannot discover." Descartes thought himself deceived, but was he really? And as much as I admire the mind of René Descartes, the beginning of modern philosophy, he simply gave up his reason for an excess of rationality. Like Plato, Descartes thought that the senses and imagination of the body were erroneous. Indeed, as they might be, let's look at the incredible description of Descartes looking out of his window in Meditations on First Philosophy. Even Descartes knew that his rationality was excessive. Quote, "What could be a greater symptom of madness?" End quote. Think of concerning a 16th century view of mental disorder, much different than a post-1900s view of insanity. Quote, "What could be a greater symptom of madness," says Descartes, "than to look out one's window and see machines instead of real people? The point I want to make is that this kind of vision, is what the rationality he had embraced leads to, not by mere chance, not by a momentary caprice, but by the inexorable logic of the rationality to which he is committed. Only a philosopher could talk in this way, being skeptical and amused about the existence of people. But in real life, outside the study, such a way of talking would be judged mad, a subtle symptom of paranoia," says Descartes. Descartes, at times in the 16th century, during the Reformation, between the Renaissance and the scientific revolution of the 17th century, displayed an extraordinary lack of intuitive understanding, for he sees the knowledge of his own body as constituted only by the intellect, rather than by being self-evident through intuition and the senses. Descartes here thinks that he has an imagination that can make probable conjecture. Did Descartes want his readers to take him seriously? Quote, he says that I can make a probable conjecture that the body exists, but this is only a probability, and despite a careful and comprehensive investigation, I do not yet understand how the distinct idea of corporeal nature, which I find in my imagination, can provide any basis for a necessary inference that some body exists. End quote. Again, Descartes thinks that bodies are not perceived by the faculties of sense and imagination, but only by intellect alone. This perception derives not from the touch or sight, he says, but from being understood. Descartes saw the world not as it was, but simply as a representation. This view is simply being an observer of a representation, imperfect as it might be, of what is, enables Descartes to achieve certainty and fixity, but at the expense of content. Objectification is a means to dominate and control. Again, this Cartesian worldview would lead to devitalization and bureaucratization in society. Hume and Kant would bring philosophy back to reason, however. And interestingly enough, the concept of boredom arose in the 18th century Enlightenment as well, defined as the dreariness of non-engagement. Boredom is highly associated with a passive view of experience, a view of vitality, and in a sense is mediated by a stimulant which comes from the outside world of which we are only recipients. The result, as the Romantics would come to understand, of the imagination bringing something into existence between ourselves and what exists in the corporeal world, in which we are the designers of our own experience. Three propositions are said to have been the foundations of Enlightenment thinking, given that Western culture has dealt with the explicit resolution of both questions and answers. First, all genuine questions can be answered. If it cannot be answered, it is not a true question. I apologize about my phone falling off of the platform. It did this earlier when I was doing a lecture on when I finished a lecture on Descartes. Hopefully it does not happen again. I apologize. So, all genuine questions can be answered, and if it cannot be answered, it is not a true question. Secondly, all answers are knowable and discovered by means which can be learnt and taught to other persons. This view is highly suspect now, but it was a view of the Enlightenment. And thirdly, that all answers must need be compatible with one another. So in my view, the ancient realm and the medieval realm and the Renaissance realm behaved as though these tenets were true, but were not consistent in holding them. Outside of the enterprise of academia, these tenets had yet began to change culture, enough for it to change its own tenets in relation to their thoughts and actions. In historical hindsight and context, it does not matter in a sense, historically speaking, because all three propositions are now considered to be obviously false, as I have said. History and science shows how things are not as answerable as we might like to think. Not all true questions are answered or are satisfactorily answerable yet. Answers are not always compatible with each other, and not all known and discovered answers can be learned and taught. The necessity for enlightenment as a fixed certainty nevertheless creates a problem for the arts. The imagination found within the very nature of the arts is intrinsically ambiguous and uncertain in comparison to the empirical nature of scientific inquiry, observation, description, and explanation. In regard to scientific facts in history and subsequent formulated abstract frameworks that help to codify and explain cogent data analysis. And there are found continuities between the Reformation of the 16th century and of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, given that the scientific revolution occurred as the phenomenon between the Reformation and the Enlightenment, the long 19th century of Romanticism, and the Industrial Revolutions that followed. It is interesting to trace both advancements made in music, philosophy, art, and science, as well as the created bodies of knowledge being formed again into systemized structures and the history of knowledge, insofar as humanity's ingenuity and innovative power changed the very world in which we exist and the way in which we have come to comprehend the world as it is. The Enlightenment is nothing without light. And so, we look to Prometheus's flame, clarity, precision, the negation of the negative emotions, an optimistic belief, considering humanity's now existent belief that humanity has the power to control its own destiny. A revolutionary phenomenal idea, considering the history of humanity experienced throughout its many centuries of historical existence, and the civilizations of peoples found and identified throughout the known world, as it has been and how it is now. Remember that at this time, the majority of human prehistory and evolution was not known to the Enlightenment thinkers. The age and experience of prehistorical, geological, and biological Earth and the age and expanse of our galaxy, let alone other galaxies in our universe, was not known either. Remember also that the Enlightenment period was pre-19th century and pre-20th century. So we have to exclude all of this knowledge in order to understand the average intellectual's comprehension of the world and the universe at a time when new ways of thinking were flourishing in knowledge of what the people of the time knew. In light of vision, the light of vision became more foreign to us as we began to progress in self-consciousness. Hearken then back to the year 1317 CE, when this idea was already implicitly expressed and foreseen in the Renaissance, on the tomb of one of the first makers of eyeglasses, in Santa Maria in Rome, whose tomb inscription reads, quote, "God forgive him his sins," emphasizing the influence of religiosity at this time. Interesting to note, outside of the West, optics were particularly well developed in the land of the Chinese and in Eastern Eurasia. The eyeglasses themselves, inspire the effect that humans are able to reflect, and through reflection, on its own understanding. Indeed, modern optics illustrates the modern conceptualization of the intellect as a source of reflective knowledge. The Greeks made the first discoveries of optics, but their knowledge was lost until it was largely enhanced by the Enlightenment, so that individuals could see more cogently. The actual word reflection was, in the 17th century, a reference to thought processes, for John Locke would in 1690 define reflection as, quote, "that notice which the mind takes of its own operations and the manner of them," end quote. And that comes from an essay concerning human understanding. Okay, enter Guillaume Battista. All right, Guillaume Battista, as early as 1725, Vico, the Italian humanist philosopher, referred to the barbarism of reflection. In the Enlightenment, the first source of amusement for the traveler of landscape images is the pursuit of object, the expectation of new scenes continually arising to the individual's view. Nature is like a painting seen by the eyes. Indeed, the powerful, all-surveying, all-capturing eye achieved its, what one would call, an apotheosis in Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. Interestingly enough, a simple prison design which enables prisoners to be under total surveillance while at the same time being themselves unaware of when they are being watched. This is with Jeremy Bentham proposing this from 1747 to 1832. Jeremy Bentham was the father of utilitarianism, but he was socially awkward, and who, according to J.S. Mill, never, unless on occasion, talked or courted women, but referred to his walks as antigentacular before breakfast. Circumgallations, the act of traveling about, or simply traveling about before the breakfast. Jeremy Bentham's teapot was named Dick, and Dapple his stick. Ages and nations exist purely for the instruction. They are measured by their knowledge of actual facts. And given that J.S. Mill's importance, he existed in the phenomena of the long 19th century and will be addressed in my lecture on 19th century reality. But Bentham here is studied because of his, might I say, utilization philosophy, and it is pertinently useful to the age of enlightenment in which Bentham was an experiencer of. See the essay on Bentham in Utilitarianism and on Liberty. Knowing so little of human feelings, Jeremy Bentham still less knew of the influences by which those feelings are formed. All the more subtle workings of both the mind upon itself and of external things upon the mind escaped his notice, and no one probably who, in a highly structured age of human civilization, never ever attempted to give a rule to all human conduct, set out with a more limited conception either of the agencies by which human conduct is, or of those by which it should be influenced. And that is Mill talking about Sir Bentham. See the works on the Enlightenment by reading and understanding those that were in it. Ironically, Thomas Hobbes, although he is important, did not exist during the Enlightenment, but before the time of the human Enlightenment. From 1685 to 1815, this is the time of the Enlightenment philosophers. You have certain pertinent thinkers like Leibniz, John Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Reid, Immanuel Kant, and Schelling, and also ending with that of Hegel. Honorable mentions during this time were, like I said before, John Stuart Mill, Schopenhauer, and Rousseau. And an in-depth study let's see here. In-depth study of the Enlightenment. Art is by nature in the Enlightenment implicit and ambiguous, and it speaks to humans through the senses, even if the medium between the two is language, which acts as a bridge between the artist and the artist audience, and it have effects on humans given their physicality of being in the world, which they call planet Earth. Enlightenment art is concerned primarily with the human intellect, transcending, if possible, the limitations of the contingent and physical. Most people gravitate towards music or architecture, two examples of art forms that are inherently implicit, even though they might be about something. Because they are this way, they also are the least vulnerable to explicitness, and for this reason have survived best from the enlightened world of the explicit. When one listens to Haydn, for example, in the Enlightenment period, there is a sense of relieved tension between opposites held beautifully in balance, a pleasure in symmetry. On the dark side of the Enlightenment, you have Mozart displaying elements of perturbation, never being superior to his characters, but acknowledges a shared vulnerability. Because of the importance of their legacies, the French Revolution and the American Revolution were Enlightenment period products, which exemplified principles and claims that were and still are pertinent in society today. The French Revolution comes from the Enlightenment's ideas and stands out in stark contrast to ideas usually associated with the latter movement, Romanticism. And of course, as you know, Romanticism on a national level is nationalism, which we have covered in our 19th century history. Principles of the Revolution were universal reason, order, and justice in the French Revolution, and is not connected to ideas that came later on in the Romanticism realm, which will be covered later on. But key things to explore. In contrast, the Enlightenment and the French Revolution associated with it did not see a sense of uniqueness, a profound emotional introspection, a sense of the differences or dissimilarities of things as opposed to the similar. And as we shall comprehend, the Romanticist movement will spur things on quite nicely in the Saga of Humanity Present. In Edmund Burke's speech on conciliation with America in 1775, he hints that liberty is the freedom which can be experienced only through belonging within a certain complex of constraints. If one takes a famous claim from the American Revolution, i.e., the individual right to pursue happiness, one of many goods, one can understand that the expression of the belief that any good, happiness for instance, should be susceptible to the pursuit of human will and aided by rationality. One also sees the illuminated paradoxical nature of reality, in this case, rationality, that while the rational mind pursues the certain measure of happiness, the pursuit itself does not generally lead to happiness. The best things that can be obtained cannot be pursued themselves. But we might ask why. Well, certain logically desirable goals simply cannot be directly or explicitly pursued or examined, for to do so would change its very nature and render them unapproachable indirectly or attainable implicitly. Therefore, the champion concepts of the Enlightenment, such as liberty, equality, and fraternity, of the French Revolution, must not be directly encountered, i.e., equality becoming the need and drive to destroy that which unequals equality, as if it was pursued through the mayhem and carnage of the revolution itself. The concepts themselves, in order to emerge naturally, are necessary accompaniments of a certain tolerant disposition towards the world. There was, during the Enlightenment period, as in the Reformation, abuses of power. And as we know that power is knowledge, in the case of both priest and monarch, that were both sometimes justified by reference to a divine authority or a figure, an intolerable state of affairs, we see a similarity in that the abuse is not the primary target, but the thing abused. Not idolatry, but images, not corrupt priests, but sacerdotal and the sacred. The destruction of the sacerdotal power of the Church was a goal of the French Revolution, just as it had been for the Reformation. Though the last was not explicitly secular but sacred in outlook, the effect a transfer of power from the church to the state, an essential part of the relentless process of secularization, itself a religiously created term in a broad sense. The French Revolution was openly opposed to the church, the sacramental or sacred, and by extension, aristocrats whose authority was reciprocally related to that of a monarchical power. The king was a metaphor of the divine presence, and the authority by which he ruled, shorthand for everything rejected in regard to this sacramental world. In the age of enlightenment, the king acts as that which we have reverence, the divine in the human. It is in enlightenment we see that it is the divine in the human that matters. It is not the divine in a god, a priest, or a king. When we look at Tocqueville, De la démocratie en Amérique, in the 19th century, we can see that enlightened conclusion contrasts differences between Thomas Jefferson and Tocqueville. The American Revolution in the United States, which is the greatest success in the history of the entire world, approach was not to do as much as possible to bring freedom into being by an effort which was the French model, but the approach was laissez-faire, to do as little as possible, as few restraints as possible, the aim to see the reduction of formal restrictions on society, while maximizing communality and in the interest of economical well-being. Jefferson saw democracy as local, agrarian, and communitarian in its overall structure of constitution. But with hindsight as a historian, the democracy Jefferson envisioned was completely destroyed by the ruthless mechanized force of capitalism and industrialization. But what de Tocqueville saw was the lack of values carefully incorporated in the fabric of society would lead in time to a process in which we become subject to bureaucracy and servitude to the state. But what happened, and what of the age of the enlightened realm? It has become increasingly obvious as a historian and social theorist concerning the last century, the 20th century, that despite its optimism concerning the human condition, it was a period of uncomplicated progress in human comprehension and in society and politics in the most general sense. The lesson that I give is that an appeal to reason can lead to light, but it can also be used to monitor control, to constrict, and to repress.